When the NHS was founded, it was a central part of the UK's post-war social contract. Now, it's struggling to perform, and there are increasing calls for what some people are calling reform, which is all too often a euphemism for further privatisation or even a shift to some form of insurance-based funding. In other words, for a fundamental change to the business model of the NHS, which has always been a public service, free at the point of use and funded through progressive taxation. So given the importance of that issue, we decided to take a look at the facts. What is the rational way forward for the UK? We pulled together a team of volunteers with expertise ranging from NHS management, senior clinical expertise, through financial analysis and economics. And that team has produced a report, The Rational Policymaker's Guide to the NHS, which you should have in front of you. Imagine specifically that you were a rational policymaker who had been given the challenge of charting the future course of healthcare in the United Kingdom. How would you go about it? Well, you'd probably begin by asking yourself three questions. What works in practice? What went wrong? And what about long-term sustainability? So, of course, healthcare systems are immensely complicated, and there are many ways to assess their performance. From the point of view of citizens, there are three things we can ask that should be effective. When we're ill, we should receive high-quality healthcare, at least on the same sort of level that we would expect in other developed countries. Secondly, we want it to be equitable. The quality of care that we receive shouldn't depend on how wealthy we are or how important we're perceived to be. If we need it, we should get it. And finally, since we are taxpayers as well, we want it to be efficient. The definition of efficiency is output divided by input. In the case of a healthcare system, the output is the quality of care provided, and the input is the resources that go in, which are principally money. So we shouldn't be spending more than other countries for the same standard of healthcare. So that's all we can ask, but it's not all that we care about. If the inputs are not there, the outputs are bound to be poor, however efficient the system is. And context matters. The US has very poor life expectancy compared with other countries, and part of that is gun crime, overdoses, and other external causes. Even if the US had the best healthcare system in the world, they'd probably still have a problem of life expectancy. So benchmarking healthcare systems is complex. Fortunately, there are several established international benchmarks that we can look at, and of those, the most comprehensive are the ones which have been produced by the Commonwealth Fund. So here is a summary of the Commonwealth Fund analysis published in the year 2014, which is using data mainly from 2011 onwards up to 2013. So as you can see, the benchmarking shows a clear number one, that's the top line, which is the UK. It's not just number one overall though, it's number one in terms of the quality of care, it's number one in terms of access, it's number one in terms of efficiency, and it's excellent, but not number one in terms of equity. It's not anything like number one in terms of healthy lives, and that's because of the context. The UK has, compared with these other countries, apart from the US, very high levels of inequality and poverty. This report also shows a very clear number 11, which is the US system. The long-term picture is similar. The UK has slipped slightly in recent years and it's no longer number one, but overall the UK has the best track record. Why is that? Well, the UK system naturally scores very well on equity. A system which is free at the point of use and funded from progressive taxation is the best way of delivering equitable healthcare. It also scores very well on efficiency. That's both because of the scale of the operation, and in particular the enormous buying power that the NHS has, but also because of the dedication of its staff, many of whom have known for decades that they could earn a bit more elsewhere, but they stayed with the NHS because they believed in it. We've now reached, well, we're now well beyond the point where governments can exploit that loyalty further. So in summary, looking around the world to see what works in practice gives a clear answer. The pre-underfunded NHS was the best model, which has so far been demonstrated in an advanced economy. A rational policymaker would start with that fact, but he or she would still want to check the other two questions. So let's take a look at what went wrong. In essence, the answer is very simple. It was underfunding. We have been spending since 2010 less than other advanced countries. We've been spending a declining percentage of GDP on healthcare, and most importantly, our spending has not been keeping pace with the needs of the UK population. You can see the picture very clearly. There was a noticeable change in funding policy from 2010 onwards. You can see the kink in that red line. Before then, as with other countries, the UK had been spending a gradually increasing percentage of GDP on healthcare. Since 2010, it's been a gradually decreasing percentage. And spending in the UK is now below almost all the other developed economies. The other line which is worth looking at is the top line, the US. In terms of efficiency, as well as several other measures, the US system is by far the worst in the developed world. A rational policymaker would certainly not consider modelling the future healthcare system in the UK on the US system. Most importantly of all, though, our spending is no longer keeping pace with need. The government claims that it's spending more than ever before on the NHS, but that's only true if you ignore the impact of inflation, of a growing population, of an ageing population, and of a population with increasing rates of ill health. When you take those things into account, you see a very different picture. And of course, £1 in the year 2010 went a lot further than £1 does in the year 2023. So a rational policymaker wouldn't ignore those other factors. If we focus on the bottom line in this chart, which does take those factors into account, then we can see that whereas we had been increasingly able to meet need up until the global financial crisis, we have been decreasingly able to meet it since then. And the results reflect that. These charts show that both in terms of outputs, such as the ability of the NHS to meet its waiting list targets and the emergency admissions targets, and in terms of outcomes such as life expectancy and avoidable mortality, the NHS has been increasingly struggling to perform since the underfunding began. So our rational policymaker would have by now established that the pre-underfunded NHS was the best model that's so far been demonstrated, and that the reason for its recent underperformance is underfunding. So on that basis alone, he or she might be tempted to conclude that the best strategy was to recommit to the fundamental business model of the NHS and to fund it properly. But there is still the question of sustainability. The fact that the NHS was the best model for much of the previous 75 years doesn't guarantee that it would be sustainable for generations to come. Well, it's tempting to duck that question. We've already established that the NHS is the most cost-effective system in the countries studied. So if we can't afford the most cost-effective system of universal healthcare, what we're really saying is we can't afford any system. But we shouldn't duck it. If there are problems of affordability in the future which are building up, we should start planning for them now. Fortunately, our analysis suggests no such problems. To look at sustainability, we need to explore the linkages between the healthcare system and the wider economy over time. And when we start to do this, we see several important chains of cause and effect. The first one is what we call the capacity loop. The economy is driven by people. Well, specifically, the economy is driven by healthy people of working age. And the number of healthy people of working age is driven by the treatment provided by the healthcare system, as well as by factors affecting rates of ill health. At the moment, we have about 2.5 million people, working age adults, currently unable to work due to ill health, which is about 7% of the total, and it's rising fast. Successful treatments are driven by capacity to treat, and capacity to treat is driven by funding. And funding, of course, is driven by having a healthy economy. So we can see that there's a self-reinforcing loop. If we get it right, it's a virtuous circle. If we get it wrong, it's a vicious circle. On its own, that looks simple enough, but we need to consider other similar loops which interact with that one. The second loop is the poverty loop. So Michael Marmot's work on the social determinants of ill health has shown that deprivation and its consequent impacts on things like quality of housing, stress levels and diet all have an enormous impact on rates of ill health and therefore treatment needed. And that feeds in, adversely affecting the health of the population and adversely affecting the performance of the economy. Spending on prevention, as long as it's effective, reduces lifestyle factors which cause illness, and therefore it reduces treatment needed. You reduce the amount of health funding needed, and so you actually make it easier to continue to fund adequately. Now, when we put all that together, and there are other things as well which are important, morale and retention is a critical issue at the moment. So we put all those loops together and we see a diagram like this, which is technically called a causal loop diagram. And many people find it very difficult to get their minds around that. And the temptation is to say, well, I'll ignore it then, I'll just use my common sense. But that doesn't work. Ignoring those loops doesn't remove them from the real world. You've all heard Sir Michael Marmot talking about his research into social determinants of ill health. That's the poverty loop. If policymakers ignore that loop, the consequences don't disappear in the real world, they get worse. Fortunately, the discipline of system dynamics has developed over the last 70 years or so, precisely to enable rational policymakers in business initially to tackle this kind of complexity. So we built a system dynamics model based on those three loops and used it to assess three types of policy. First of all, different approaches to funding the NHS. Secondly, different approaches to poverty reduction. And thirdly, different approaches to investment in prevention. So let's start with funding. We saw that since 2010, government policy on funding has been to gradually reduce spending on the NHS as a percentage of GDP. We don't know what the government's end goal is, but we can model different levels of funding and trace their impact around that capacity loop. And when we do that, this is what we see. Without significantly greater funding than today, the UK is highly unlikely to reach what the OECD had forecast to be the UK's GDP for the year 2060. That's the top green line. Even worse than that, if the government were to pursue a policy of cost reduction further into the future, we could be headed for a generation of zero growth. The lower horizontal line is today's GDP. And a generation of zero growth is something which is essentially unheard of in a modern developed economy. But in either case, current policies are pointing towards economic failure. What's the alternative? Well, of course, there are many alternatives. We've modelled a scenario where government policy has three strands. First of all, fund the NHS in line with need. We saw that hasn't been happening. So the first strand is to fund in line with need. The second strand is to increase spending on preventive healthcare. And the third strand is to use the resulting growth in GDP to fund poverty reduction initiatives. And the results are extremely encouraging, although there is a need for very significant increases in funding over the next few years, which is largely because of the need to rebuild capacity after the years of underfunding. A little bit similar to what happened between 2000 and 2010, when funding did increase on the NHS and performance increased. But in the long run, NHS funding will not need to increase as a percentage of GDP year on year. It is long-term sustainable. This scenario also sees far better economic performance. With this policy, growth will be higher and the UK will meet the OECD targets for GDP in the year 2060. So in short, while a properly funded NHS is sustainable and is good for the UK economy, an underfunded NHS will mean a failed economy. So in conclusion, what our research has shown is in essence very simple. The pre-underfunded model of the NHS was the best proven model for healthcare delivery. It's been struggling, and it's struggling increasingly severely because of prolonged and severe underfunding. But with proper funding, it can be restored to its natural position as the world's best healthcare system. If we don't do that, as well as producing a healthcare disaster, the UK economy will fail. So the choice for a rational policymaker is very clear.